In 1921, a young indigenous woman from Alaska stepped onto a ship bound for one of the harshest islands in the frozen Arctic. She wasn't chasing glory or adventure. She needed money desperately to help her dying child. The people organizing the trip promised her safety, help from others, and a quick return home. Every single promise turned out to be a lie. Left behind on Wrangel Island when everything fell apart and people vanished, she faced something unimaginable. She had to stay alive through freezing temperatures that could kill, terrible hunger, constant fear, and complete loneliness, all by herself. Ada Blackjack came into this world in 1898 on Alaska's Seward Peninsula in a small native community, where the weather wasn't just something you looked at through a window. It ruled everything. The wind could tear your skin apart. Snow could make every path disappear, and the cold would punish even the smallest error. While Ada was still very young, her father passed away. Shortly after losing him, her mother made a difficult choice and sent Ada and her sister away to Nome, where Methodist missionaries would raise them. It was trading one kind of difficult life for what her mother hoped would be better opportunities. Living at the mission, Ada picked up English and learned how to read and write. She learned all the household tasks that made a girl valuable in a town run by white people. She cooked, she cleaned, she washed clothes. But there was something important she didn't learn during those years. The old traditional skills that kept native people alive in the harsh northern lands were never taught to her. She didn't learn how to hunt animals, how to trap them, how to build proper shelters, or how to understand the ice. The missionaries did teach her one skill that would prove as valuable as any weapon, though. Sewing. In the frozen Arctic, a well-sewn seam isn't just about making things look nice. Your life depends on it. Ada became incredibly skilled at taking animal skins and turning them into clothing that trapped warmth inside and kept moisture out. She made boots and thick coats that could prevent a person's body from freezing solid. When she turned 16, she married a man named Jack Blackjack, who worked as a hunter and drove dog sleds. The marriage was filled with violence and cruelty. He beat her regularly, he starved her, and eventually he just left her completely alone. Ada gave birth to 3 children during those hard years. 2 of them died. The one who survived was named Bennett, and he suffered from tuberculosis, a terrible illness that slowly tightened its grip on his small body year after year. After Jack abandoned them, Ada walked along, exhausting miles back to Nome with her sick boy, carry him on her back whenever his weak legs couldn't support him anymore. She scraped together whatever work she could find to survive. She cleaned other people's houses. She sewed for miners, anything that would bring in a little money. Eventually, the painful truth became clear. She couldn't afford the medical care Bennett needed. With a breaking heart, she placed him in the Jesse Lee Home for Children, the same kind of church-run institution that had raised her. She made a promise to herself that this would only be temporary. In 1921, with hunger always lurking nearby and her son still waiting for her to come back, Ada heard about an Arctic expedition that needed someone who could sew. The pay was $50 every month, which was more money than she could ever dream of earning in Nome, doing odd jobs. She didn't sign up because she wanted an exciting adventure. She signed up because she desperately needed a way to buy her son Bennett a chance at a future. The expedition was the brainchild of Jalmer Stephenson, an explorer born in Manitoba who had a gift for charming people and a habit of calling the far north the friendly Arctic. He talked as if a place of endless darkness for months and deadly cold could somehow be made gentler just by giving a pleasant nickname. Stephenson wanted to claim Wrangel Island for Canada and the British Empire. The island was remote, completely uninhabited, and its ownership was unclear. He spoke about the island's future potential with great confidence. He imagined it as an outpost, a base for airplanes flying over the North Pole, a station for radio communication and weather monitoring, a good place for hunting, a valuable investment. His grand ambitions all depended on one simple thing: getting people to stay there long enough to plant a flag and use that as proof of ownership. He recruited 4 young men for the job. Alan Crawford was 20 years old and from Toronto. He would be the official leader because he was a British subject, which mattered for the political claims. Fred Maurer was 28 and from Ohio. He had traveled north before and carried the complicated desire of someone who felt drawn back to a place that almost killed him. Milton Gow was 19 years old and from Texas. He was cheerful, had a magnetic personality, and was eager to prove what he could do. Lorne Knight was 28 and from Oregon. He had spent years learning Arctic survival skills and had previously survived on nothing but meat and endured brutal cold. He was confident in a way that could either save your life or end it. None of these details mattered much to Ada when she first heard about them. She wasn't thinking about flags or claiming territory for empires. She was thinking about Bennett's thin chest slowly rising and falling as he struggled to breathe. She was thinking about that $50 every month that could buy medicine for her son. She was thinking about building a future that didn't end with him trapped in an orphanage forever. Still, Ada hesitated before agreeing. She was naturally shy, and she carried fears that sometimes bordered on complete panic. She was especially terrified of wild animals, particularly polar bears. Wrangel Island had a reputation in northern stories as a place where bears lived. There were old legends and there were real facts, and in Ada's mind, these two things twisted together until she couldn't separate them. The organizers told her that other native families would be joining the expedition. They promised she wouldn't be the only woman there, that she would have familiar voices and faces around her for comfort. That promise was important to Ada. She had good reasons not to trust men. She had lived through the terrible consequences of being trapped alone with one. The thought of being stuck on a remote island with 4 strangers frightened her deeply. The day finally arrived to leave, and the promised families never showed up. The local people who truly understood ice and seasons had taken one look at the expedition's limited supplies and poor timing, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. Standing on the dock, Ada was completely alone. For a moment, she tried to back out of the agreement. Then the men gave her fresh assurances. They told her they would recruit families in Siberia during the journey there. Ada's desperate need, and perhaps her willingness to believe in other people's promises, pushed her to move forward. She had also asked for advice from someone who could see the future, and the warning she received was frightening. Yes, she would sail on this journey, but death and danger waited ahead, along with knives and fire. Ada decided to go anyway. There's a particular kind of courage that doesn't feel like bravery when you're actually living through it. It simply feels like you have no other choice. On September 9th, 1921, a sailing ship carried Ada and the 4 men away from Nome and toward Wrangel Island. They also brought along a kitten, one of 3 cats that had been on the ship earlier in the journey. The expedition received her as a mascot, and they named her Vic. The cat seemed like an absurd source of comfort in a landscape that would soon feel like the very edge of the world. But small living creatures have a special way of keeping people grounded. The route included a planned stop at East Cape in Siberia, where the men hoped to get in Umiak, which is a traditional skin boat that's essential for hunting seals and walrus. They also hoped to hire Inuit helpers. They failed at both goals. The boat they needed cost too much money. The people they needed to hire didn't agree to come. They bought a heavy wooden dory instead, which was a poor replacement for a proper skin boat, and they continued forward with their optimism covering up a growing list of serious problems. Violent storms battered the ship during the crossing. The wind showed no mercy. It ripped apart their gear, soaked their clothing completely through, and punished their hands. At some point during the journey, a boat they had managed to obtain was blown away by the wind, leaving them with even fewer resources than they had planned for. When Wrangel Island finally appeared out of the Arctic haze, it looked less like a great opportunity and more like a judgment being handed down. They landed in mid-September and raised a flag, officially claiming the island for Great Britain. Ada watched the ship that had brought them there pull away from the shore, and she felt something strange in her chest that both loosened and tightened at the same time. Part of her desperately wanted to run after that ship. Part of her understood that she had already crossed a line she could never uncross. The men immediately turned their attention to the work of building a camp. Ada turned away to hide the tears running down her face. Wrangel Island didn't offer any trees, but it did offer driftwood. There was enough to build structures and enough to burn for heat. The expedition members set up tents and began constructing a winter house built against a hillside. They made a frame from logs, with walls that would later be made stronger with blocks of snow, and a roof insulated with chunks of sod and earth. A wood-burning stove would serve as the heart of their shelter. Inside the structure, they hung tents within a larger space for extra warmth. Ada's sleeping space did double duty as the kitchen area. The men's sleeping space was larger than hers. Even out here in the wilderness, boundaries between people still mattered. In the beginning, the expedition almost felt normal. Alan unpacked his scientific instruments and books because he intended to document the island's geology and wildlife in detail. The men went on hikes and carefully recorded everything they saw. They set traps to catch foxes. They hunted animals whenever they could, though their skill with guns was uneven and inconsistent. Ada worked constantly without much rest. She cooked all the meals. She cleaned everything. She mended torn clothing. She sewed new garments from animal skins. She scraped the hides clean, and she kept the camp functional and running. In the evenings, there were occasional moments that felt light. Alan told terrible jokes. Lauren made up silly poems. Ada sang hymns from her mission days. Milton tapped away on a typewriter, and Vic the cat wove between their legs looking for warmth. But isolation creates its own kind of weather system in the human mind. Within just a few weeks, Ada's homesickness deepened into something much heavier and harder to carry. She cried frequently, sometimes so hard she couldn't control it. She thought about Bennett constantly until thinking about him actually hurt. She grew increasingly anxious, and at times her behavior became erratic. The men were young, restless, and completely untrained in showing compassion. They didn't understand her grief at all. They teased her about her emotions. They didn't trust her. When she refused to patch a pair of boots one day, Lauren tied her to a flagpole and left her there until she finally agreed to do it. The act wasn't discipline or correction. It was humiliation, a clear demonstration of power. It showed Ada exactly where she ranked in their private hierarchy and social order. Ada's terror of polar bears didn't make things any easier. Bears appear around the camp regularly, sometimes close enough that the boundary between their camp and the wild wilderness completely vanished. One night, while the men were away from camp, Ada heard heavy footsteps outside the tent. She heard sniffing, snorting, and breathing. These were the intimate sounds of a predator trying to decide whether you might be food. Ada stayed completely motionless in the darkness. The fire died out slowly. The cold soaked deep into her body. She waited for the men to return the way a drowning person desperately waits for air to breathe. When Milton finally arrived back at camp, he shot the bear and killed it. He found Ada huddled in absolute terror, her face rigid and frozen with exhaustion. As winter closed its grip tighter around the island, the expedition's store of food supplies dwindled faster than anyone had planned. The men had arrived with limited supplies because they felt confident they could add to their food by hunting animals. Sometimes they succeeded at this, and sometimes they didn't. The brutal cold forced them to stay inside the shelter for long stretches of time. The wind howled and screamed against their shelter with the steady rage of something alive and angry. Darkness settled over the entire island for months at a time, and the human mind, which was never designed to handle endless night, began to break down and fray at the edges. Then came the first betrayal from the world beyond the island. The relief ship did not arrive in 1922 as planned. Stephenson had secured a ship called the Teddy Bear to bring them supplies and reinforcements, letters from home, fresh food, and the ordinary proof that other people still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. The ship tried hard to reach Wrangel Island, but failed completely, forced to turn back by brutal ice conditions that made the journey impossible. Back on the island, Ada and the men watched the horizon day after day after day, looking desperately for any sign of a sail or smoke from a ship. By mid-September, they knew with certainty that no ship would be coming. The knowledge hit them like a physical blow to the body. Their 6 months' worth of groceries were completely gone. From now on, they would have to live entirely on whatever animals they could kill. The winter of 1922 to 1923 wasn't merely cold. It was subtractive, like something was being taken away constantly. It stripped away comforts first. The coffee, the tobacco, the potatoes all disappeared. Then it began stripping away their physical strength. The signs of scurvy started to appear in their bodies. Scurvy isn't a romantic disease. It's a condition that dismantles your body slowly and cruelly, piece by piece. Your gums swell up and become soft. Your teeth start to loosen in your mouth. Your joints ache constantly. Bruises bloom across your skin. Exhaustion becomes a permanent state of being. The cure for scurvy is fresh vegetables or citrus fruits, which were completely impossible to get on Wrangel Island. The only practical defense against it was eating fresh raw meat, especially the blood and organs that carried small but vital amounts of vitamin C. The men moved their camp to a new location to find fresh driftwood and new fuel to burn. They stared at maps for hours and calculated distances carefully. The idea that began as a backup plan turned into their only real plan for survival. They would cross the frozen sea ice to reach Siberia, then travel hundreds of miles overland to reach a wireless telegraph station and call for rescue. The distance was enormous and overwhelming. The ice was unstable and dangerous. They had very few dogs left. Yet starvation has a strange way of making impossible plans feel reasonable and doable. In January 1923, they made their attempt. The sled they loaded was carrying too much weight. The dogs were weak and struggled to pull it. Massive pressure ridges rose up like walls made of broken, jagged ice, too steep and tall to haul the sled over. The extreme cold punished their fingers and faces with frostbite. Alan froze his fingertips so badly they turned black. After 2 miserable weeks of struggle with very little progress made, the men returned to the camp, beaten down and deeply discouraged. A second plan formed in their minds, and this one was colder than the weather itself. 3 of the men would make the journey, and 2 people would stay behind at the camp. Lorne Knight was too sick to travel anywhere. The scurvy had hit him particularly hard. Ada, who was still terrified of traveling across the ice and still terrified of bears, and who still lacked the traditional hunting training she had never been given, was chosen to stay with him. The decision made practical sense to the men who made it. It was absolutely devastating to the woman who had no voice or vote in the matter. On January 29th, 1923, Alan Crawford, Fred Maurer, and Milton Gow left the camp with the sled and the dogs. Ada watched them walk away until the white distance completely swallowed their bodies, and they disappeared. They gave her their promise that they would return quickly with help and rescue. Ada clung desperately to that promise, because considering the alternative felt like staring into an abyss. The very day after they left, the wind rose up fierce and powerful enough to split ice apart and erase every track they had made. Ada and Lorne carefully rationed their remaining bread, eating just 6 small pieces each day. The bread was hard and dry. They waited anxiously for birds and seals to return when spring finally came. They had traps set, but trapping isn't magical. It requires patience combined with luck. Their survival depended completely on getting meat. Their survival depended more and more on Ada's efforts. Lorne's medical condition grew steadily worse. He passed out and collapsed while chopping wood one day. Ada found him lying limp in the snow and dragged his body back to the shelter, thinking at first that he might already be dead. He wasn't dead, but now he was frightened in a way he had never allowed himself to be before this moment. He looked up scurvy symptoms in an encyclopedia and confirmed what he already suspected and knew. His teeth were loosening in his gums. His gums had become spongy and soft. Dark spots and bruises appeared all over his body. Pain flared up at night, so badly that sleep became impossible to achieve. The book suggested drinking lemon juice and eating vegetables as treatment. The book might as well have suggested he learn to fly. Ada took on all the chores around the camp. She hauled fuel for the fire. She tended the stove. She scraped animal hides clean, and she checked the traps regularly. She did all this work while still being too afraid to carry a rifle with her. She did it while knowing that polar bears could appear without any warning at all. At first, she carried only a snow knife, which was a thin blade that offered more psychological comfort than any real defense against a bear. Hunger pushed her to go farther outside. Fear pushed her to stay closer inside. Between these two opposing forces, she learned to move very carefully and deliberately. When she caught her first fox in a trap, she brought it back to camp with a kind of fierce pride burning in her chest. Fresh meat mattered enormously. It provided calories for energy, and it served as medicine against scurvy. Lorne, who was weak and increasingly irritable, criticized her work constantly. He called her lazy. He called her stupid. He called her thoughtless. He threw these words at her like stones aimed at someone who was already struggling just to stand upright. Ada snapped back at him with her own sharp words. They fell into long, uncomfortable silences. Sometimes Lorne accused her directly of starving him on purpose. Ada's response was simple and honest. She was starving too. There were long stretches of time when Ada became too sick herself to check the traps, as her own body began failing from hunger and stress. During those terrible weeks, the line separating surviving from dying narrowed down to something as thin as a single breath. Ada began writing in her own journal, and in one entry she wrote about imagining her own death. She wrote about what should be done for Bennett, how he should be told about her death, what belongings he should receive. She wrote the way poor people write their wills, not as proper legal documents, but as prayers against being completely forgotten after they're gone. And then something shifted inside her. It wasn't a single dramatic moment that changed everything. It was a gradual hardening, a slow shift from panic to procedure and process. Ada began to learn the island the same way the men had tried to learn it, through repetition, by paying close attention to details, by accepting the hard truth that no one else would do this work for her. She started trapping more effectively and with better results. She learned to kill whatever she caught quickly and efficiently. She began practicing with a rifle, setting up targets, forcing her trembling hands to become steady. One day, she shot a bird right out of the air and brought it down cleanly with one shot. The act was small when measured against the massive scale of the Arctic wilderness, but it was absolutely huge inside her own sense of self. It meant she was no longer just waiting around to be rescued by other people's competence and skill. Spring returned to the island like an old promise that was kept reluctantly and without enthusiasm. Birds came back from wherever they had gone. Eggs appeared in nests along the cliffs. The daylight lengthened gradually. The island, which had felt completely dead under the darkness, began to stir with life again. Ada gathered whatever food she could find. She hunted animals. She made herself constantly watchful and alert. She built a raised platform above the camp so she could scan the area for bears approaching and for ships on the horizon. She worked on building a boat from wood and animal skins because having a boat would mean she could access seals and walrus and the dense fat that could carry a person through another entire winter. In one attempt, the boat she was building was lost to the wind, a cruel lesson in how quickly the Arctic can completely erase your hard labor. Ada started building again from the beginning. She learned valuable lessons from the failure. She did not have the luxury of giving up and quitting. Lorne did not recover or improve. By June, he was completely hollowed out by scurvy and starvation. Even in this terrible state, he still criticized her constantly, complaining about how she skinned the hides and how she did everything wrong. Ada finally told him directly that she would do things her own way from now on. The shift wasn't merely about technique or method. It was about authority and who was in charge. Ada, who had been treated like a tool to be used, claimed the right to lead and make decisions. If she was going to survive and live, she would live by following her own judgment. Lorne Knight died in late June of 1923 after many months of steady decline. Ada recorded the exact date in her journal because facts and dates were what remained when everything else had been stripped away. She could not bring herself to drag his body far away, so she built a barrier of rocks and would around him keep scavenging animals away from his remains. It was a crude grave, but it was what she could manage with her strength. The island was full of hungry mouths looking for food. Now Ada was completely alone except for Vic the cat, the last small witness to 2 years of terrible misjudgment and incredible endurance. The men who had left in January heading for Siberia never returned to the island. Ada watched the horizon anyway, day after day, because hope is stubborn and persistent even when it becomes painful to hold on to. She continued hunting. She gathered eggs from nests. She killed her first seal all by herself. She stored whatever meat and supplies she could. She kept working without stopping because the alternative was facing a second winter completely alone, and she did not know if her strength and sanity would stretch that far. In August, heavy fog rolled across the island again. Ada moved through her daily routines with the numb efficiency of someone who had survived too long to waste any motion or energy. Then she heard a distant rumbling sound, at first easy to mistake for walrus calling to each other. She climbed up to her lookout platform and raised her field glasses to scan a gray world that refused to reveal anything clearly. The sound returned, closer this time and steadier than before. The fog thinned just enough to reveal a mast, an actual ship. Ada ran for the beach as if her legs belonged to someone else and were operating on their own. She splashed into the cold surf, ready to swim out to the ship if she had to. She expected to see Alan, Fred, and Milton step down from the deck, grinning at her, apologetic for the delay, but alive and well. Instead, a stranger approached her. His name was Harold Noyce, and he had been sent north to retrieve whatever was left of Stephenson's failed venture. Ada immediately asked where the three men were. Noyce had no answer to give her. He had expected to find all of them waiting on the island. Instead, he found only Ada, terribly thin, filthy, dressed in animal furs, her face deeply lined by cold and hard work. When she finally understood that she was the last person alive from the expedition, her strength finally broke through protective shell she had built around it. She collapsed on the shore and wept with her whole body. Before leaving the island, Noyce's party buried Lorne Knight properly, with a real grave. Ada gathered what little remained of her life in that camp. She collected tools, clothing, and the ragged proof that she had endured and survived. She took one last long look at Wrangel Island as the ship pulled away from shore. She would later describe it as an island of death and disaster. Whatever grand dream Stephenson had sold to people in warm, comfortable rooms back in civilization, the island had answered with its own brutal truth. Back in Nome and farther south in other cities, Ada's survival became a story that people wanted to use for their own purposes. Newspapers praised her as a female castaway, calling her a Northern Robinson Crusoe. They admired her devotion to duty, as if her many months caring for a dying man were some quaint feminine virtue instead of brutal physical labor performed under the constant threat of starvation. Then came the uglier turn in public opinion. Accusations emerged that she had deliberately let Lorne Knight starve to death. The charge was fueled by fragments of complaints found in journals and some missing pages, and by the disturbing ease with which a poor indigenous woman could be blamed for a white man's death. Ada defended herself quietly but firmly against these accusations. The accusation was eventually withdrawn officially, but suspicion has a way of lingering in the cracks of a person's life. Ada did not return home rich or wealthy. She was not paid everything she had been promised when she signed on. Other people profited from telling the tale far more than she ever did. But she had survived, and survival was never the end goal for her. It was simply the means to an end. She used whatever money she could scrape together to reunite with Bennett and seek better medical care for him. For a period of time they lived in Seattle, chasing treatment options and stability the way people chase any faint possibility of relief and hope. Later on, Ada had another son named Billy. She married again. Her life continued forward, filled with work and struggle and ordinary human complications, as if those 2 years on Wrangel Island were simply another scar she carried among many others. Bennett grew up to adulthood, though illness never truly stopped shadowing him throughout his life. When he died decades after the expedition ended, it struck Ada with a heavy finality of grief that has been waiting a very long time to finally land. She herself lived into old age and eventually returned to Alaska. She died in 1983 at the age of 85, far away from the wind-scoured beach where she had once run desperately toward a ship appearing in the fog. After her death, those who loved her fought hard against the quiet eraser that so often follows women like Ada, women who don't fit the heroic mold preferred by history books and official records. Alaska state legislature issued a formal recognition of her courage, calling it a small token for a woman whose incredible bravery had gone unnoticed and unrecognized for so many years. A plaque was mounted at her grave, plain and direct in its words, naming what she'd been when everything else had been taken away from her. It called her the heroine of the Wrangel Island expedition from 1921 to 1923. If you strip her story down to its bare bones, it becomes easy to make it sound like a simple triumph. One woman outlasting and surviving longer than 4 men in the Arctic wilderness. But that simplified version completely misses what really happened to her. Ada was not sent north because anyone believed she would become a legend or a hero. She was sent because her sewing skills could keep other people alive, and because her own desperate poverty left her very little room to refuse the offer. She arrived on that island without the hunting training that her ancestors would have considered absolutely essential for survival. She arrived carrying a deep fear of the very animals that dominated the island. She was mocked by the men. She was mistreated. She was humiliated. She watched men make terrible decisions with complete confidence. She watched the promised help fail to appear when it was supposed to. She watched scurvy slowly dismantle a strong man's body piece by piece. She watched 3 men vanish into the sea ice and never return to tell what happened. And then she did what the Arctic forces people to do when it has stripped them of every other option available. She adapted to survive. She learned to hunt because hunger was not something you could negotiate with. She learned to shoot accurately because fear alone would not feed you. She learned to work through sickness and pain because nobody else would do the work that needed doing. She learned to keep going even after death surrounded her because stopping meant dying. She survived not through some clean cinematic courage that looks good in movies, but through relentless, exhausting persistence, the kind that rarely looks or feels heroic from the inside while you're living it. When Ada was asked later in life what kept her alive during those terrible months, she spoke about her son. She had to live for him. It wasn't a dramatic line meant for newspapers. It was the most practical truth she knew and understood. In the frozen Arctic, love can function as a tool just as real and useful as a rifle or a trapline. It can keep your hands moving and working when your mind is screaming at you to lie down and give up. It can make you stand up one more time in a world that is perfectly content to watch you fall and stay down. Wrangel Island took nearly everything away from Ada Blackjack. It took her health. It took her peace. It took years of her life. But there was one thing it did not take from her. It did not take her will to survive. If this story moved something in you, challenged the way you think, or made you rethink what human beings are truly capable of when placed under extreme pressure, please take a moment to like this video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who might need to hear stories like this. And if you want to hear more true stories about survival, exploration, and the thin line that separates failure from triumph, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.